Shalom, everyone, and thank you again for joining us on another episode of Crossing Boundaries. My name is Kim Passi-Yosef. I'm streaming live to you from Tel Aviv, Israel, and together with me is one of our amazing co-founders, Aziz Abu Sarah. And we also have one of our most, I would say, expertise guides, Yuval Ben Ami. He's actually streaming from France, and we're trying to get his audio to work. So for now, we'll just start the conversation, me and Aziz, and hopefully Yuval will be able to.
He's just joined us, so let's see, Yuval, do you want to try to say hello? It's still not working.
Not working, can't hear you. Okay, well, today we're trying something new because we're trying to do a series that is focusing on the diverse religious and ethnic populations of the Middle East. Actually starting to work on the series and understanding how many groups there are, we decided to start with a brief history of the Middle East. And Aziz, can you give us some background on this general topic? It's huge.
I think what I wanted to do is potentially, and Yuval, you can keep cutting me if you're fixing stuff. We'll see if it's working or not. As long as I'm not hearing you, I won't recognize it. But what I wanted to do is potentially just look at the Middle East as a whole, look at the influences of the Middle East, a little bit of the history of the Middle East. And I think in some ways you'll be surprised, as even as we were preparing for this, we found about all kind of groups. And, you know, I've studied quite a bit about the Middle East, and I was learning about the groups I didn't know about, because it's such an interesting place full of different ethnic, religious, and you know, by religious, I don't mean just Muslims, Christians, and Jews. There's all these ancient, even religions that you don't really hear about so much. And it's just fascinating. And so through the next few weeks, we will be talking more and more about who these people are, what's really the history of these communities, and we'll try to get as many of those as we can. I don't think we'll be able to cover everybody just because it's so many that we will have to be learning about. So I want to start with a little bit of just history of our area, and this is.
And Aziz, while you're bringing it up, sorry, just if there are specific communities that you've always been fascinated with or interested in, I urge the listeners to Facebook chat us or chat on Zoom and tell us who they are so that we know what to focus on in our next episodes. And go ahead, Aziz. Sorry for cutting you.
No, absolutely. And also eventually ideas for next series. What should we be focusing on after that? So one of the earliest places, or the earliest place of civilizations we know about in our history, is the area of Mesopotamia. And the area of Mesopotamia, as you can see it here, it's the Fertile Crescent. That's basically Iraq, part of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and it goes into Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. That's basically where a lot of the things, a lot of civilizations that we have today, a lot of the earlier civilizations, and a lot of what we've been influenced by come from this region. And this is where this is why I think, because it comes out of this region, there are so many different groups, so different, different ethnicities. Hello, Yuval. Can we hear you now?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, lovely.
So Yuval, to join me whenever you want. I want to just go through a little bit of a few maps, and then I have a couple of questions for you as soon as I go through them. But if you want to cut me off and add something, either you or Kim, feel free to do that. So hold on. This is another example of how things just move around in the Middle East. And here we talk about religions and the spread of religions from 0 to 600 AD. We're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and you can see all these things. And you see another religion. It's the Mithraism. I think I'm saying it right. It doesn't really exist today. It's a Roman religion. It was mainly carried by the Roman soldiers. It was kind of a younger Apollo-like god that became very popular, and it was spreading also quite fast. As we can see in the map, these arrows tells us how these religions were spreading, and that created even more and more diversity. And to the right, we see in Persia Zoroastrianism and how it kind of mostly stayed around the Persia region, but it did go a little bit here and there as well. And this is as Islam comes into the picture, and you'll see this picture keep moving because it will show you different times of how Islam spread. And that's why you see different Muslim groups, like we know about the Uyghur now in China, and we know about, now you can see all the way through Central Africa, you have different Muslim groups, but these Muslim groups were not monolithic. There are so many different beliefs and different communities, and that will explain a little bit about some of the groups we will talk about today. This is a bit more recent, and colonization, which also influenced how each one of these groups ended up where they are today, ended up in power or not in power. For example, Syria, we have a minority group called the Alawites are in power in Syria, and that was due to the British control after World War I. And then you have Turkey and Turkish influence in many of the areas in the Middle East. So we will go through these weeks through some of those communities. This is one of my favorite maps because it shows you it's very complicated map too. It shows you some of the different ethnic, religious people who live in the Middle East. It goes as far as Afghanistan, and each color is giving you kind of a bit of different groups, and we will be basically touching on some of those groups in the next few weeks, and we'll be touching on many of those groups actually also today. But it shows you, I think, the diversity of the region, that there's not only one color, there's not only one community, there's not only one group, there's so many different people that live here, and it almost looks like a mosaic, a really beautiful mosaic. And we can look at the idea of minorities, smaller communities, so on, as problems sometimes because it causes discord and it causes issues in many of these countries, unfortunately. You can also view it as something positive, as something that brings that diversity is something incredible. And that's the way I think we all here view it. And so we'll talk a bit about that as well. This is a more recent, and the changes and the conflicts in the Middle East, I think, and how it's changing movement around. And this movement, including these especially minority groups that have been immigrating, but it even changed the way people are immigrating, which lines, which countries people are going through. And it's mixing the population of the Middle East in a way that has not happened in hundreds of years, for sure. That is happening today. We see a lot of people leaving countries like Iraq. Many of the minority groups there have left. Syria, many of the minority groups there have also left. And so areas of conflict have caused a lot of changes to the life of many of these minority groups. And here I come to one of those minority groups, that ethnic groups, diverse groups, I guess. And actually, I'll come to you a little bit, Yuval, on that, because the Kurds are a very well-known community in the Middle East. They are a community that have suffered significantly a lot in the Middle East through history. We know in Iraq they have, and it's kind of amazing because Kurds are Muslims, or many of them, majority of them are Muslims. They, in our history, they actually play a very important role in Islamic history. You know, one of the most famous Muslim leaders is a guy named Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. And Salah ad-Din is often referred to as the greatest Arab general, war man who freed the Arab Muslim world from the Crusades, so on, so on. Yet that's an inaccurate information, because actually Salah ad-Din was a Kurd, was not an Arab. So the greatest hero in Arab history is actually a Kurdish man, is not an Arab man. And I know, Yuval, I've spent some time in Turkey with Kurdish communities. You have as well. And I was wondering if we can start with a bit of your story traveling through Turkey and going into some of these areas.
Okay, happily. But I'll start with your permission, with three disclaimers. Three. One, when we speak about the Middle East at large, I have to admit my limitations as a traveler. As being an Israeli, I have little right to see much of the neighborhood. Others may be much better traveled in this region. I'm better traveled in Europe than I am in the Middle East due to the limitations of travel imposed on us and imposed on others. The second, or you know what, I'll skip to the third. We're going to speak about diversity of character, of identities and diversity of different groups. Oh, here is the second one. Speaking about groups that I do not belong to, and that is something that's very risque. So in advance, I'd like to apologize for any kind of generalizing that's unnecessary or mistakes that I might make. They're just going to happen. And the third is when we're talking about diversity, and when we're talking about diversity in the Middle East, I'd like to stress that when I speak about it, it's not as an ideal, but as a reality. My wife is now listening to this podcast about diversity. It's a very critical podcast about diversity in a school in Brooklyn, in a public school in Brooklyn. And she said to me, the white parents in that school, they're interested in diversity, while the black parents are interested in equal opportunity, in totally different things. So I don't want to talk about diversity as an ideal, but as a reality that is often ignored. What we have in the Middle East, and particularly in my experience in our native country, Israel, Palestine, is real diversity that's often overlooked. And Turkey, where I traveled, is another such place. It's not only overlooked, it's dismissed, it's been made illegal to hold a certain identity. And I thought of myself as being quite an advanced traveler when I traveled east into Turkey, bearing that in mind. I knew that once I cross the Euphrates River, I will be in Kurdistan. And the first city across the Euphrates River was Urfa, or Shanli Urfa. And I expected it to be Kurdish, but what instead I found there was diversity. A lot of the people there were ethnic Arabs. Some of them were Kurds. A lot of them were Turks. And certainly the culture that was visible to the eye was Turkish, because only the Turkish language was visible due to regulation and law. But the funny thing is that I felt close to home. The architecture, the mosque minarets, they reminded me of what you might see in the West Bank, for example. And I realized only after entering Turkish Kurdistan that the identity of places, the perceived identity of places, the real identity of places can oftentimes clash. If certain lines hadn't been drawn on the map the way they were right after World War I, Urfa would have probably been a part of Syria. What I felt is I'm in a Syrian city. I'm in a Syrian city with an imposed Turkish identity and a large number of Kurdish locals. And then I had to think, what is Syria? Isn't Syria that? A mix of different identities that at the time that I was there was already boiling over because of an imposed identity being Syria itself. It was really mind-boggling, especially traveling later to Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir, the large city to the east, is definitely a Kurdish city. the language spoken by people is Kurdish. Again, it's not visible to the eye. You feel the history of Kurdish insurgency there. You feel that you're in a city that's strongly been influenced by the PKK, and its politics are left-leaning. You felt that you were in a very secular city. That has to do with the recent history of the Kurds in Turkey. It was quite fascinating. And then what happens after you travel through a map that you thought you knew, you thought made sense, but makes different sense because you speak to people and you see how they read their places differently, is you redraw the map. I redrew it, splitting. There is a chain of 3 cities: Gaziantep to the west, a Turkish city; Urfa in the middle, a Syrian city, whatever that means; and then Diyarbakir, a Kurdish city. And I loved all of them. They were all just wonderful.
And you know, this is incredible. As you mentioned that, I was thinking people might not know, but a country like Iraq, for example, over 20% of its population are Kurds. 20%, that's a significant. Iraq is a 35, 40 million. I'm not sure what's the most recent number. When you say 25%, that's almost 10 million people who live in Iraq alone, not counting the Kurds in Turkey, not counting the Kurds in a little bit in Syria, a little bit, you know, there are Kurds in multiple places, not counting those, and in Iran. Just in Iraq alone, we're talking about approximately 7 to 10 million people, which is a large community. We're not talking about just a small minority, but it's also a community that has been strongly interested in independence, potentially in having a nation state, and it's one of those groups that have failed in achieving that. And it's kind of interesting because even though they are Muslim, often when I talk to, I meet quite a bit of Kurds, I find a lot of identification they have sometimes with the Palestinians, but sometimes with Israel. Yes. Because they say, well, we are a nation state, like Israel is a nation state, and you know, we want to have our own country, which I find a quite fascinating discussion because, you know, the assumption often, well, if they're Muslim, they must be 100% pro-Palestinian, which the more you know the Middle East, you know, that's not really the case.
There's a little more to it. I don't know enough about the history, but I know that Israel has been supportive of certain Kurdish insurgent groups back in the day, at least, you know, 70s, 80s, and that remained in the collective memory. When I told that I am from Israel in Diyarbakir, I was very warmly received. And again, like you, I was a bit surprised. I thought to myself, when I think of you, you remind me of the Palestinians, you know, in your national aspirations. Why would you not be mad at me for, you know, representing the nation that oppresses your mirror image? But it's not necessarily a mirror image, for first, and secondly, there has been a lot of trust created among our communities.
But in Iraq specifically, they did manage the Kurds to receive some sort of independence on a small region in the north, right?
Not so much independence. They're still part of the Iraqi state, and the Iraqi state has a lot to say. They did vote for independence, and the Iraqi government rejected that. They have some kind of self-rule. So they have an ability to make internal decision within, kind of like the way states work in the US. They have a lot of power internally within their state, but they don't have, for example, all the power over their national resources. That has to go to the federal state. Iraq, as we know, is also extremely corrupt. So if you don't have power over your national resources, it is a problem. I'm not sure even Kim and Yuval, if you know, because this, Kim, was before you joined MEJDI, we actually used to run tours in Kurdistan, Iraq, in the northern part of Iraq. And we ran a few trips. Our last trip there was supposed to happen 4 or 5 weeks after ISIS took over. And so we had to cancel it. But we had a Christian group who was going there. We worked mainly with Christian groups who were traveling there to build relationship with other Christian communities in the Kurdistan region, because it's not only Kurds who live there. Again, there are many Christian groups who live in that area. And it was it was amazing to be able to run these tours. And it's very sad we kind of had to stop, and hopefully soon we'll be able to come back, because from what I hear, I haven't been to the Kurdistan, but from the traveler who went there, it's unbelievably beautiful, beautiful region. You're on the corner kind of between Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. That's a spot you want to be in. All right, so go ahead.
It's definitely a spot that Yuval and I would want to be in, but not 100% possible.
At the moment, it's
Some
not
of it,
100% possible to be anywhere. I would like to raise a question, and it's the question of nationalism, the identity of a nation versus what you call a minority group. I'm just listening to you, Aziz, and I noticed that you chart out, you say, here is a territory, it is a country, it's sovereign. Within that country, 25% of the people belong to a different identity, and it would make sense that they would then perhaps create their own country. But then within them, there will be a new minority group.
Even more complicated, because within that country, you have majority of Shias who feel certain identity, and then a minority of Sunnis who are not that much larger actually than the Kurds in Iraq, a little bit larger. And then you have so many other smaller groups within it. So the national identity is a big, big question in a place like Iraq, because one of the ideas is, can really a country with many different groups exist as one state? Or is it supposed to be broken into multiple states?
Yes, and in the Middle East, it brings us to like a very basic issue of the Middle East, very basic but still under discussed, which is how artificial the sovereign states are, how they are the product of colonial powers of the First World War, Sykes and Picot, drawing straight lines on the map and so forth. The whole idea of minority group, though, the word minority sparks something negative in my brain. Why? Because in Israel, minorities were often used as a euphemism for Arabs. And you would say, oh, they are some minority people. There's even a term for it, b'nei mi'utim. They did this and that, and they are we wouldn't say Arabs, you would say minority. The minority is belittling. The minority is saying, well, they countless, so however we react to what they did, that's what counts. I'm thinking of countries where the majority group is ruled by, the sovereign state is held in the hands of what is essentially a minority group. They're not independence. That's one example. Jordan is one example, and Israel, Palestine is one example, because currently there are more Palestinians between the Jordan and the sea than Jewish Israelis, yet Israel is the de facto sovereign of the entire territory. So the term minority, b'nei mi'utim, it doesn't really hold water anymore. I'm thinking how the whole concept of the sovereign nation is a little bit contrived, but so is the concept of minority groups. And both of them can be, in their different ways, romanticized. And both of them can be, in their different ways, dismissed and not taken for what they really are. Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's the case in a lot of continents all over the world. I mean, I don't think it's unique to the Middle East, but I agree.
You talked about manufactured borders, and I was thinking of a story, Yuval, you often told on our tours about manufactured borders. And here's a picture of it, so we'll remind you what we're talking about. This is the border between Lebanon and Israel, and it's ridiculous border because you can see the line, the blue line is kind of the de facto border. There's no peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon, but there is a border, and we see this town here, half of it is under Lebanese control, and the other half of it is under Israeli control. And you may be one of a handful of Israelis who are not military, who are civilians, who were able to go to the Lebanese part.
Yeah. Well, once you get into town, you can physically wander into the Lebanese part. There is no barrier. The barrier is located south of the town. The town is named Rajar, and it's directly on the border. To try and explain what this town is identity-wise is just a great little example of how crazy things are in the Middle East. This town is Alawite. You mentioned the Alawites, who are still the ruling religious identity in Syria. They are Muslims. They are their own denomination of Islam. This is the only Alawite town in Israel. How did it come to be so? It was initially in Syria, and it was conquered by Israel in a way by mistake. I mean, I'm afraid to say that because there is a military history behind that, but Israel did not realize that it was conquering an Alawite town when it conquered the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War. And there was then talk about giving it back to Lebanon, but really it was part of Syria. It became very complicated. It remained part of Israel. And there you have, when we're talking about identity, and soon we'll talk about the border issues, which are so interesting there, you have this town, which is Arabic by language, Muslim and Alawite by religious identity. Its residents were granted Israeli citizenship, so Israeli by citizenship. Talk about minority groups, they are the only ones of their kind who are now part of Israel. And that is complicated in and of itself enough. But what happened to them later was at first uplifting and later tragic. Israel in 1982 entered Lebanon, and later for 18 years held on for a strip of Lebanon that was under military occupation. It had Israeli military presence. During that time, that village, which was hugged by Israel from, and you can see with the line on the map, from nearly, from three sides, suddenly it had land on which to expand. It couldn't actually expand to the east because there were military installments there, but now it could expand to the north, and they built a new neighborhood within Lebanon. They were not in contact with the rest of the Lebanese population there because they became, for the most part, Israeli citizens. There was animosity between them and groups in Lebanon, certainly Hezbollah, Palestinians in South Lebanon, etc. So it was just, they still commuted into Israel, but they built a neighborhood, the northern neighborhood. Then in the year 2000, Israel withdrew its troops out of Lebanon. And while Israel insisted, and here I'm a little bit mad, Israel insisted there was a certain kibbutz that expanded its graveyard into Lebanon. And Israel fought and fought and fought to have the line now be redrawn around that graveyard. It did not fight for that neighborhood. I mean, you could also make an excuse for that. It's huge. If you were to start fighting for that, you will never have any kind of agreement on the northern border. So they redrew the blue line, which is the term for the Israeli-Lebanese border, exactly where it was before, leaving half of the town north. And the border fence remained to the south of the town. So to get, and the whole Israeli-Lebanese border is fenced. To get into that town, and I came as a translator for a German journalist, we had to slalom around 16 different concrete blocks.
Just walk in.
You can't just walk in. No one is allowed. I remember we were also told, do not go into the Lebanese side. Of course, we were daredevils and we did it. That was actually just a few months or weeks, I think weeks after there was a shoot down with the Hezbollah and Israeli soldiers in that town, and 5 Hezbollah combatants were killed. And the shootout was very near the school. It was a scary place. These people were abandoned north of the border fence. And we were told, don't go into the Lebanese territory, but gradually we realized a lot of the public buildings like town hall, for example, were actually built within Lebanese territory. So anyway, we had to enter it to visit them. And so we took a little spin around. And when we started coming back down, somebody came to us and he said, what are you doing here? And we said, oh, no, we got confused. No, we're coming straight back to the southern side. And he said, do they just let you walk around here? And we said, no, we're coming down to the southern side, and making an excuse so he won't be mad. But only later I realized he didn't say, he wasn't saying this angrily. What, they just let you walk around here? He was saying, what, they just let you walk around here? Like, people can come and walk around my neighborhood now and it's a normal place? Well, unfortunately, no, it is not a normal place. I can't say for much of Israel, Lebanon, or the rest of the Middle East that there are no more places there. But that is certainly one of the strangest ones on various counts.
But they come into Israel from the southern part? They come for shopping or for anything else?
For any kind of employment, because they can't run a business from the village. There's a single business, which is the falafel stand, very nice falafel. At least at the time there was. It was 2005 when I visited there, before the Second Lebanon War. But they commute to Kiryat Shmona and to other places in the north and work over there. And we could see from the edge of the village, we could see Hezbollah positions and barrels. It was visible.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story because we talk about manufactured borders, and this is one of them. But the truth is, the whole Middle East is line after line of manufactured borders. That conflicts we have today, whether it's Sudan and Egypt, whether it's Algeria and Morocco, whether it's Israel and Palestine, whether it's all these countries have border disputes. Very similar actually to this, where you have a community that was with one country ends up with the other country, and the lines get drawn, you know, some say without thought, other would say maybe on purpose in a way to keep that that conflict kind of happening. And so many places in the Middle East have those border disputes because of older whatever lines that just didn't make sense.
I have a thought, and I think it would bring us, it would bring together the talk of diversity of groups and the talk of the borders. I'm now living in Europe. And Europe, what borders are not imagined? What borders are not artificial? The border between France and Italy, very near where I live, or the border between France and Germany, they are also contrived and have moved over the years. However, in the reality of Europe, at least today, maybe it wasn't so in the Middle Ages, it's easier for communities to adopt a new identity based on the sovereign land that they're in. I have seen this in my lifetime happening in Alsace, between France and Germany. When I traveled Alsace in the 90s, a lot of people still spoke Alsatian, which is the local dialect of German. When I came back about 5 years ago, I couldn't hear any German anywhere in the same towns. So people, you know, because they now, since World War II, they're a part of France, they have adopted the language, they've been given citizenship and so on. I think identities in the Middle East are a little tougher to break because they come to, first of all, the religious element is very, very strong. Where you have a border between communities that are religious, but I think linguistic differences. What really makes the Kurds Kurdish? What more than anything else? There are various things. There is a different cuisine, a different history. There is the whole memory of harm done to them and by them, between them and other nations. But more than anything else, they're not Arabs. If Arabs are defined by the Arabic language,
right.
and then and the Kurdish language is is a Persian language group. Okay, German and French belong to different language families, and evidently it can happen that a community abandons its language in favor of another. But it didn't happen to the Kurds. I wonder what it has to say about the Middle East and what identity means there as compared to here in Europe.
Well, we're talking about Middle East as a whole, but let's zero in on our own region. And Kim, maybe I'll ask you this. You have got to see diversity locally. Couple of communities you got involved with, Ethiopian communities where you volunteered for quite a while, and you even went to Ethiopia to learn more about it, and the Mizrahi communities as well. So even when, I mean, we were talking about minority as Arabs in Israel, even though they're not really minority, all of that, but within within every community that even might see itself as that's our group, you still find there is more diversity, there is more backgrounds, things are not really as simple as they seem. I mean, the Ethiopians have incredible culture, but also incredible challenges being in Israel. The Mizrahis are the same. So can you touch on that?
Of course. I'll just connect shortly to what Yuval was talking about with languages. I think that Israel took in so many immigration waves from the point it actually established itself as a country. And you'd think that as a very young country, we were trying to create some sort of Israeli identity. But all of these people were coming in with different languages, with different cultures. And one of the prominent things is that some of them, especially, for example, in the kibbutzim, they just left all of their history behind. They pushed it to the side in order to become this one Israeli. But what is unique about the Ethiopian Jews, and I'll talk shortly about their story in a minute, is that they're coming with a whole different, sorry to say it, but color, and a whole different religion, not religion, sorry, culture. They're coming from a place where some of them have never used, I guess, weren't regular to not use their hands when they were eating, were not used to modern life as we knew it when they arrived to Israel. So the language is interesting in terms of the identity, but it's not always the one thing that we hold on to in order to keep our identity. It is definitely something that you may see people going back to and trying to learn now as they're trying to connect to their identity. But when I was working with the Ethiopian community, for example, already people my age didn't want to speak the language. And when I saw younger kids, some of them didn't even know the Amharic language because they wanted to be Israeli. So in order to take on this new identity, they kind of pushed their old one aside, which is, in my eyes, a bit sad to say about Israel. And I'll just talk about the Ethiopian community. It's funny, there's a story that says that Israel used to send representatives all over the world in order to bring Jews to this new state, to this new Jewish democracy. And when the representative came to these small tribes, Jewish tribes in Ethiopia, he told them, you have to come to Jerusalem. Everything is made of gold. The walls, the houses, everything is gold. And when you kneel down to the pond or the creek, you can drink milk and honey. And, you know, they were blown away by this because why shouldn't we believe it? And when they came to Israel, obviously that wasn't true. A lot of them never even got to Jerusalem because Israel decided where they would live once they arrived. And I think there was a huge difference between what they imagined they were coming to and what they actually arrived with here. And actually, Aziz, you and I were talking about interesting facts about the Middle East before, and I think Israel holds a world record for pushing in as many people into a plane as possible. For the Ethiopian immigration, it was secretive, the first one, and they actually took out the chairs out of the Boeing, the jumbo airplane, and put in as many people as they could in order to bring them to Israel. So the story doesn't end with the expectation difference, because they came into a very difficult reality. As I said, cultural gap, language gap. Israel wasn't 100% prepared to take them in. There was actually a religious issue with the state accepting them as Jews and understanding that they are indeed Jewish like us. And that's a whole story that I don't know, I think we can talk about in a different episode, unless you have questions about this specific community.
No, I think it's just fascinating to me, because even for me, being not part of that community, is realizing that barriers don't only exist between one community and another, considering Ethiopians are Jews and Mizrahis is a very, in some ways, similar story, where you know, kids being taken away from their family. I mean, some of the stories, at least I hear, especially from the beginning of the state of Israel, which is back then when it wasn't run by the crazy right-wingers, supposedly it was run by the leftist, socialists, supposedly the good guys, right? And yet the stuff they've done were horrible. And I read those stories as a Palestinian, I'm like, oh, okay, we've suffered through this conflict, but others also have suffered, and that just complicates things, because if you internally within your own group suffering, it just makes all of us traumatized. And I was reading a few years ago, the Ministry of Health in Israel made an apology to Ethiopian women because they were sterilizing them, and they were giving shots so they don't have babies, and told about it. And I'm like, wow, to my knowledge, that didn't happen to us, because we still have many babies. So I don't think it happened to us. I'm thinking, my goodness, there's so much wrongs that happens toward those communities. That sometimes
it actually came out only in 2015. I mean, you're talking about things that happened in the 50s and 60s, but to me, it was shocking that this happened only, until 5 years ago. And a classmate of mine, Ethiopian, she was sitting next to me and she said, I was lucky enough to have Faranzi or non-Ethiopian friends that would tell me, oh, I'm taking this pill and I'm doing that. And I told them, what are you talking about? The doctor told me I have to get this shot. And they told her, what shot? We've never heard of it. So, you know, knowing someone my age, it's kind of mind-boggling. But you started talking about the Mizrahi Jews, and it's true that horrible things happened there too. I mean, I have to say that, and I thought to talk to Yuval about it as well, but we were talking about diversity. I mean, my parents came from, my father's family is from Egypt, and my mom's family is from Argentina, which actually ran away from World War II, coming from Poland. And my husband's family is from Yemen and from Morocco, and that's Israel. That's what Israel looks like. But unfortunately, this one small community of Ashkenazi Jews coming from Europe that took, I guess, the lead of how they will shape the country, they did a lot of wrong to these other communities. And we're talking about, like you said, kidnapping children to families that were having trouble to have kids, which is something that is still kind of secretive. They're not putting out to the media all of the information, and these families are still trying to figure out what they're missing before these mothers pass away. We're talking about spraying them with DDT when they arrived to Israel, being scared that they're coming with, I don't know, bugs or disease. And it also goes to education. The idea was, I want to believe the idea was good, trying to say, okay, these people are coming without education. How can we help them find jobs? They have so many kids in the family, right? 12 kids, 16 kids. We want to help them come out of poverty. So we'll create two school systems. One will be professional, and the other is still the regular school system. But unfortunately, through the years, we can see that it's created a bigger gap between the communities and not otherwise.
Right. Yuval, you and I have talked about this quite a lot. The whole concept of, I remember once we were talking about music, and we're talking about Israeli music and Arabic music, and you made a comment about how for a while culture in Israel was Ashkenazi, to talk about what is art, what is good music. And it's changed significantly since then, or to some level. But I wonder what's your take on it, because I know you've been active in those things and protests also with Ethiopians. I know you've been out in the street with them.
I've been out in the streets, but first and foremost, I belong to the guilty party. You know, I'm entirely Ashkenazi Israeli, and I come from the background that defined itself, and I think that's where it ties back a bit, as the majority. No matter how many of us there is and how many of the other groups, we are the template, we are the default, and everyone else should try, of course they're going to try and fail, to adapt to us, to what we bring to the table culturally, linguistically, religiously, etc. Sure, they're going to fail. We're going to keep them as a minority, and we're going to look down on them. And this is part of what happens, and this is both the chicken and the egg. It's what happens when you reject diversity as a reality, not accept it as an ideal, but and not see that you yourself have created it. Because again, it's the Ashkenazi establishment that made Israel into what is probably the most complex tapestry of identities in the Middle East, especially if you include the Palestinian identities that are there, and then dismiss it as diversity, call it a failure, and preserve these communities as the working class, as the poverty class. And like you say, it's changed a bit for various reasons, but there has not been real taking of responsibility by the quote-unquote majority community, the most powerful, the dominant community, which still is economically and politically this one community that I happen to belong to. To come to terms with that is very difficult. It takes a long time. I'm still in the process, personally.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because all these divisions, to me, sometimes, you know, there's a diversity and there's a divisions of it. And one thing that annoys me personally is, like, I find so much cultural similarities with Israeli Jews who are from Arab countries. You know, people who come from Yemen, like Adam, Kim's husband, who we love hanging out together because we have a lot of similarities. And yet, for some reason, these are the two communities that are at odds with each other. For some reason, maybe we know why, that reason. But I remember, like, even for security, it's hard to differentiate us. I remember going with Elad Vazana, who's one of the tour guides. We were in Tel Aviv and we were entering into some area and there was a checkpoint and they were, you know, profiling Arabs and asking for IDs. And I walked in and they didn't recognize me as a Palestinian, but Elad is a shade or two darker than me. And they stopped him and they took his ID, and I stood in the inside just laughing because look at this, I passed and he didn't. And I'm like, we so similar, we look alike, we think a lot of times alike, we have so much in common, and yet we've been sold this idea that we're not culturally similar. And half of Israel are Jews who came from Arab countries, who immigrated to Israel from Arab countries, from Egypt, like your dad's family came from Morocco, from Algeria. I mean, a lot of the food in Israel comes from those locations. Things like shakshuka came from Northern Africa. And we are divided, not realizing how much we can have together, how much we get along actually together. So
I think it's also a bit of an issue of pride in this. I mean, pride in the diversity, pride in these cultures, to just give it space. As Yuval was saying, this Ashkenazi regime is not giving space to other cultures, but today we can see it starting to change. And I usually like to state the best song of the year. Once it is a Mizrahi song, then you know that the culture is starting a little bit to change.
That's actually really good, because Palestinians love Mizrahi music. Like first music I listened to in Israel was Mizrahi music, although in the Ulpan, they only taught us Western kind of music, Israeli, Western, Ashkenazi music, which sounded like things, I don't know, made in the US. And then I found Sarit and those singers, and I love it. And I remember started meeting peace activists. Most of the Israeli peace activists are Ashkenazi, by the way, not Mizrahi. And I started meeting them, and I'll talk about Sarita, and they're like, oh, listen to real music. I'm like, she is real music. I like her stuff. And they'll be so judgmental over like, no, that kind of music. Oh, Mizrahi. Oh, what's wrong with you? And I felt judged listening to Israel. I'm like, I'm reaching out. Look at me branching out. I'm listening to Hebrew music. And they're like, not good enough. You know, classic.
Can I say something though? Can I interject? I just want to say I really love Sarit Haddad, and I'm saying it as a fan. But I think here is where it's easy to confuse diversity as an ideal and diversity as a reality, because you have the cultural attributes of different groups, and they can be highlighted over the years. This is what happened to the music. The music of Mizrahi Israel came more center stage. It started being played on the radio. It's in record stores. Well, now there aren't any anymore, but for a while it was where it wasn't before. That doesn't mean that equal opportunity was created. So sometimes the cultural attributes of a group, including language, certainly cuisine, can come to the foreground. I'm thinking about Palestinians in Israel and how strong the cuisine is. And we say, oh no, but today we all eat makrube. We all know what it is, so you're fine. That doesn't mean that. There is also, I'm missing the English word, but the dominant group will take in cultural attributes, sometimes emulate them, and make use of them, both to make itself feel more comfortable with subjugating the other group, and because they are just excellent. So again, I love Sarit Haddad. I love her. But that's not where it should end. And we should, when we look at diversity, even cultural diversity, but certainly the reality of the community's life, we must look at an opportunity. We must look at equality.
Project, right? I remember you doing this Lord's project where you try to bring diversity into that. And for a while, if you've gone on a tour with Yuval, he had this 1 or 2 years where he literally worshipped Lord. and
not the Lord, but the singer Lord from New Zealand, the pop musician.
And the project you did was fascinating, because what you did was bringing musicians from literally every background, in almost every background in the country, which was fascinating.
That was about recognizing diversity as a reality. Because I was actually trying to create a tribute album to Lorde, Lorde, excellent musician, very young, very cool, and joining Israelis and Palestinians, so there would be diversity. My starting point was not an understanding of diversity. I thought of my country as a dichotomy. there is me, and then there is the other. It all, I'm going to be very short because we're near the end, but it all basically tanked. It didn't work out, and the Palestinians didn't want to cooperate so as not to normalize. This is all very complicated, but in the end, the way it worked was when we took the Israeli musicians and said to each, please sing a song by Lord in the language spoken by your grandmother. And when that happened, the Palestinians joined, and we had Palestinian partners because, and that gave me my real vision for my own country, seeing it as a puzzle of identities rather than a dichotomy. When you have a puzzle of identities, me as an Ashkenazi, someone as being Ethiopian, someone from a Russian background, etc., then it's much harder for one group to be the dominant group. And it's much more the reality in which we live. We move between the spheres culturally and in other ways every day.
And those songs can be found on YouTube, if
Yes.
I remember right, and they are incredible. I remember listening to them, and it was incredible. So you can, if somebody's searching for it on YouTube, what should they search for? Just so
They can, on YouTube, they can go Lord Yiddish, Lord Russian, Lord French, Lord Arabic. There's also the Israel-Palestine Lord Diaries. It's this big project that is, it's a journal of this whole endeavor.
Awesome. This is fantastic. Somebody asked us, Kim, about Yemenites and Bedouins, and I think we're gonna talk about this. Like we said, this is a series, and we will be bringing more of these stories. I'm sure Bedouins, we just can't today just talk about them because we're gonna focus so much on the Bedouin community, and obviously the same. We can talk more about the Mizrahi community, hopefully.
Yeah.
And then the other question, whether you consider Ottoman Jerusalem as a picture to see as a diverse. I'm speaking here from a Palestinian background. I don't really love Ottoman Jerusalem that much. And the reason for that, Ottoman Jerusalem as in Jerusalem under the Ottoman control, because Jerusalem was not as important of a city for Ottomans and was not really taken care of after, in the beginning it was with Solomon the Magnificent, who did invest a lot in it. But 150 years later, 1800s, Jerusalem was neglected, and it's eventually was one of the issues that made Palestinians, I don't know how to say that, with the Jewish immigration to Israel. One of the things Palestinians tried to do is to strengthen their presence in Jerusalem as well. And that's when my great-grandparents moved to Jerusalem from Hebron, because they felt the Ottomans didn't care whatsoever about Jerusalem and felt that they need to be moving there. And a huge migration from areas like Hebron ended up happening to Jerusalem. But it was very, very poor. My family moved to Jerusalem, couldn't find a place to live in the old city, had to live outside, which was at that time very dangerous. We're talking just 120 years ago, something like that. Had to live outside the old city, and everybody was telling them, this is not a smart idea to do, you should not. My grandpa, the stories go that he would stay up all night because he was afraid of bandits and thieves attacking their house outside. But yeah, they couldn't even afford a place in the old city. It was only confined to the old city in such a small place. So I don't look at Ottomans controlling Jerusalem as the golden era. That's absolutely not the case. There were some Muslim eras that were much more successful in Jerusalem, definitely not the late Ottoman, at least.
Okay, Aziz, I think we need to wrap up, and unfortunately we won't have time to answer many more questions, but as we said, this is only the overview and the beginning of a full-on series about the different minority groups in the Middle East. Actually, next week we'll be discussing Christian minorities in the Middle East, and we'll have a few guests that can also tell us personal stories about their own communities. And yeah, we hope to see you there. And if you again are interested in...
Shannon, put back the photo. I'm asking Shannon to put back
Oh,
that photograph because
okay.
something about it.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I took that photo on a tour we were running, and I spent like quite a while trying to figure out where to take that shot from. And there was a person who was an artist on that trip, and she was literally like painting and doing stuff. And as I was moving, she's like, I think if you stand in this area, see what you can do. And then I suddenly saw this beam of light coming. This is the tomb of Jesus, the tomb of Christ. This is the Holy Sepulchre. And I've been in that church like 1,000 times and never seen that light coming down right above the tomb, because I stood kind of in the right place. And I like it because we can look at something 1,000,000 times and miss and still not see it fully, still not really understand, still not capture the beauty of it. And this photo kind of always reminds me that even if I've been in a place so many times, even if I heard about something, even if I thought I understand the situation, there's always a new way to capture it and to understand it a little differently.
Thanks, Aziz, and thank you everyone for joining us. And if you, again, have ideas or specific communities you'd like to hear about, please feel free to write us. Thank you, Yuval, for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation. And I still have so many questions and things to say, so glad we're continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Kim.
And it's not where to go to, it's how we travel. Have a good week, everyone, or weekend.